The night was still, colder than usual. A full moon hung above, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. In a small, dimly lit house on the outskirts of Tokyo, everything seemed normal. But the air inside felt thick, suffocating. A heavy silence, almost too perfect. The soft hum of an old refrigerator was the only sound. A family of 5, all gathered in the living room, sitting in a circle. The father, Hiroshi, was at the center, his eyes cold and distant. His wife, Akiko, sat to his left. She glanced nervously at him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The children, a boy and 2 girls, were unusually quiet. They could sense something was wrong. The walls, painted a once soft white, now seemed to close in on them. The dim lighting only made the room feel more oppressive, more unsettling. The tension was thick, like a storm waiting to break. Suddenly, Hiroshi stood. His movements slow, deliberate. Akiko froze, eyes wide with fear. She knew it was coming. The children shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces pale. Hiroshi turned his back to them. The sound of him rummaging through the drawer echoed through the room. The air grew colder, the silence deeper. Akiko's breath caught in her throat. She knew what he had done, what he had become. A small metallic click broke the stillness. Then a soft swish, as Hiroshi picked something up. It was a knife. Akiko felt her heart stop. Her stomach twisted. Her eyes filled with tears, but her body couldn't move. The children sat frozen, their faces empty, numb. The knife glinted in the pale light. Hiroshi turned slowly, a dark smile creeping across his face. He was no longer the man she had married. He was something else entirely. Something unrecognizable. Akiko wanted to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't obey. Hiroshi took a step forward, then another. He was coming closer. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing in on her. Then the silence shattered. A scream echoed, sharp and desperate. It was the oldest daughter, crying out in terror. But no one moved. No one spoke. Time seemed to stand still. A second scream followed. Then another. The youngest child's voice, so small and fragile, was filled with fear. Akiko finally found the strength to speak. But it was too late. She had failed them all. The cold, metallic scent of blood filled the air. And Hiroshi stood, standing over his family. The horrors of that night would never be forgotten. Not by Akiko. Not by anyone who knew what happened in that house. Akiko's body shook, but she could hardly move. Her mind was clouded with disbelief. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. Her eyes darted around, but there was nothing to do. The children, her beautiful children, lay motionless. She couldn't reach them. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper. Hiroshi stood in the center, his chest rising and falling slowly. His face remained eerily calm. The blood on his hands, dripping to the floor, formed a dark pool around him. The scent of iron filled the air. Akiko's heart pounded against her chest, as if it might break free. Her legs refused to move, paralyzed by the horror unfolding before her eyes. Then Hiroshi turned to her. His eyes, once full of warmth, were now empty. A chilling emptiness that sent a shiver down her spine. He approached her slowly, deliberately. The sound of his footsteps echoed like thunder in the quiet room. She couldn't scream. She couldn't cry out. She felt as though her voice had been stolen from her. Every step he took was like a death knell. The room grew darker. The moon outside was swallowed by clouds, leaving only shadows behind. Hiroshi stood before her now, his face inches from hers. He didn't speak. His cold, dead eyes stared into hers. The knife was still in his hand, the blade gleaming faintly in the dim light. Akiko's pulse raced. She could feel the coldness of the metal as he pressed it lightly against her skin. A bead of sweat ran down her forehead. Her body was trembling uncontrollably. She knew it wasn't over. Not yet. Not by a long shot. Hiroshi's grip on the knife tightened. Akiko closed her eyes for just a moment, unable to bear the sight. The silence, the unbearable silence, stretched on. It was broken only by her rapid breathing. Her heart screamed for help that would never come. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, was now a tomb. Hiroshi raised the knife higher. Akiko's world blurred. The edge of the blade was all she could see now. And then, a sound. A distant thud. Footsteps. The door. Someone was outside. Akiko's heart leaped with a flicker of hope. But Hiroshi's hand tightened around her wrist. He wasn't finished yet. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. Akiko's pulse quickened. But Hiroshi didn't move. He stood frozen, eyes narrowing as he listened. The footsteps outside paused. Then a knock. A soft, hesitant knock on the door. Akiko's breath hitched. Was it a neighbor? Someone had heard? But Hiroshi didn't seem alarmed. He simply stared at the door, his grip on the knife never wavering. Akiko's mind raced. Could she get away? Could she reach the door before Hiroshi stopped her? She could barely feel her legs anymore. They were so numb from fear. The door creaked again. Another knock. The tension in the room was unbearable. Hiroshi slowly turned his head, his eyes still cold but now flickering with a dark curiosity. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Akiko's hope surged, if only for a second. Then Hiroshi moved. He stepped back, his eyes never leaving her. The door. He was moving toward the door. A sense of dread washed over her. Was he going to answer it? Who was out there? Akiko didn't dare make a sound. She stayed completely still, barely breathing. But Hiroshi's movements were slow, calculating. He reached the door and paused, one hand on the doorknob. A heavy silence followed. Akiko's heart hammered in her chest. She could hear it. The faintest whisper of movement in the room behind her. Was someone still alive? She didn't dare turn to look. Hiroshi pushed the door open just a crack. The cool night air rushed in, making the room feel even colder. For a brief moment, Akiko thought she saw a figure outside, a shadow just out of reach. But before she could even react, Hiroshi stepped forward again, shutting the door with a slam. His eyes, wide with fury, locked onto hers. There was no escape now. There never had been. The knife gleamed in the dim light once more. His face twisted, showing something between a sneer and a grin. He was playing with her, playing with the last threads of her fear. Akiko could feel her heart racing faster than it ever had before. But this time, she wasn't frozen. She couldn't let him win. With a desperate breath, she made her move. She lunged, her arms outstretched. But it was too late. The knife came down. The world seemed to freeze in that instant. Akiko felt the cold steel of the blade against her skin, the sharpness tearing through her clothes. Her body lurched forward, but the pain stopped her. She gasped, the air suddenly thick in her throat. Her knees buckled, and she fell to the floor, the world spinning around her. Her vision blurred, a dark red haze spreading across her body. The blood soaked through her clothes, pooling beneath her. She could barely breathe. The coldness of the room seemed to reach deeper into her bones. Hiroshi stood over her, his expression unchanged, his eyes as cold as ice. Akiko's heart pounded in her chest, each beat growing weaker, slower. She felt her body growing heavier with each passing second. Hiroshi bent down, his face close to hers. His breath was steady, controlled, as though nothing had happened, as though it were all just a game to him. He smiled, the smile of a man who had already won. Akiko could barely lift her hand to stop him, but she tried. With what little strength she had left, she reached out. Her fingers brushed against the floor, trying to find something, anything, to hold on to. but it was futile. Hiroshi stepped back, his eyes never leaving her. The room was so quiet now, the silence deafening. Her blood seeped into the cracks of the floor, staining it a deep crimson. The chill of the night crept in, the faint sound of the wind outside barely registering in her ears. Akiko's mind was fading, slipping into darkness. And as she lay there, helpless, the house seemed to close in around her. It was over. She knew it was over. Hiroshi turned away from her, his footsteps echoing on the cold floor. Her vision grew darker, her body growing colder with each passing second. But there was something, a final glimmer of awareness, just before everything went black. The door creaked open again. The figure outside stepped inside. Too late. Too little. Akiko was gone. The house, once filled with life and warmth, was now nothing more than a tomb. And Hiroshi, standing in the middle of it all, was the only one left. The last sound to echo through the house was the soft drip of blood onto the floor. As the silence returned, it became suffocating. The truth was undeniable. This was a massacre, and no one would ever truly know what had happened here. Not fully. The figure at the door stepped into the room, but it was too late. The air was thick with the smell of blood and death. The silence that had followed the screams was now suffocating. Hiroshi turned slowly to face the new arrival. The man in the doorway froze, eyes wide in shock. He had been the neighbor who had knocked earlier, trying to check on the family. But now, he was a witness to something far darker than he could have imagined. Hiroshi's eyes narrowed as he took in the stranger's presence. The knife still gleamed in his hand, stained with the blood of his own family. The man in the doorway hesitated, his mouth opening and closing in disbelief. His gaze flicked from Hiroshi to the lifeless bodies of Akiko and the children. The house seemed to tremble with the weight of the horror that had unfolded. You did this," the neighbor stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Hiroshi didn't respond. Instead, he slowly turned back to the blood-stained floor, his expression unreadable. The neighbor stepped forward, his heart racing. It was then that he noticed the horror didn't stop with the carnage in the room. There was something more, something unsettling about Hiroshi's demeanor. The cold, detached way he moved, the way he seemed almost unaware of the devastation around him. The man tried again, louder this time. "What have you done?" His voice trembled as he took another step into the house. But Hiroshi didn't flinch. He didn't seem to care. He just stared at the knife, almost mesmerized by its gleaming edge. The neighbor's eyes darted around the room, his stomach turning. He knew he needed to leave, to run and call for help. But the door, it was too far. Hiroshi didn't say a word. He just slowly lifted the knife again. And then, with one swift motion, he advanced on the neighbor. The man barely had time to react before Hiroshi was upon him. A scream echoed through the house, sharp and piercing. But it was cut off quickly, smothered by the sound of something wet, something horrible. The neighbor collapsed to the ground, his body crumpling with a final, sickening thud. Hiroshi stood over him, his expression unchanged. His body remained motionless, but his eyes were alive with something far more terrifying than the act itself. The blood from the two new bodies stained the floor further, spreading like an unstoppable tide. Hiroshi stepped back, wiping the blade of the knife slowly, deliberately. He didn't seem to notice the man's blood splattered on the walls, or the way the room reeked of death. Everything was cold. Everything was still. And then Hiroshi finally spoke. "Now, no one will know." His voice was flat, empty, like the rest of him. The house, once a family's home, was now just an empty shell. A tomb. A place where time had stopped. And in the midst of it all, Hiroshi remained. Alone. The house, now soaked in blood, stood in the eerie silence. Hiroshi's movements were slow, deliberate, as though time itself had slowed down. His mind, if there was any part of it left, seemed distant, almost detached. He stood still in the middle of the room, surrounded by the bodies of those he once loved. Outside, the wind howled, but it couldn't pierce the thick walls of the house. No one was coming. No one would stop him. His hands, now trembling slightly, held the knife loosely by his side. The blood had begun to dry, forming a dark, crusty layer over the floor. And yet, Hiroshi remained silent. His gaze drifted to the doorway, to the lifeless figure of the neighbor. The man's eyes were wide open, still locked in a silent scream. Hiroshi's lips twitched at the corner of his mouth, but there was no real smile. There was no joy in what he had done. It was as if he was empty, a hollow shell, with nothing left to feel. He took a slow step toward the neighbor's body. The blood left behind a trail on the floor as he walked. The sound of his shoes scraping against the hardwood echoed in the silence. Hiroshi crouched down, his fingers brushing the neighbor's still warm skin. It wasn't pity. It wasn't remorse. It was simply curiosity. Curiosity about what had happened. What had changed inside him? Why had he done it? He had no answers. Only silence. He stood again, wiping his hands on his clothes, though the blood was impossible to remove. Then he turned back to the rest of the house. The children. Akiko. They were gone. And yet, they remained. In every shadow. In every corner of the room. Their faces, their voices, would never leave. He walked toward the back of the house, into the kitchen. The flickering light above cast long, wavering shadows across the counters. He stared blankly at the sink, the dishes still in place, waiting to be washed. His gaze fell to the small family photo on the wall, its edges frayed. The image of a happy family. A family that no longer existed. Hiroshi reached out, his fingers lightly grazing the frame. Then his eyes locked on something else, something that hadn't been there before. A shadow moved in the hallway behind him. His body tensed. He wasn't alone anymore. But he didn't turn around. He couldn't. The air grew thick again, almost suffocating. The presence behind him felt wrong. Too close. Too familiar. It was as though the house itself had come alive. And it wasn't done with him yet. Hiroshi finally turned slowly. There, standing in the doorway, was Akiko. Her eyes were empty, like his. Her body was pale, almost translucent. A figure trapped between life and death. She didn't speak. She just stood there, staring at him with a gaze that seemed to pierce through his very soul. Hiroshi took a step back, his breath shallow. His heart, for the first time in what felt like forever, pounded in his chest. He couldn't look away. He couldn't move. The figure of Akiko remained motionless in the doorway. And then, a whisper, as faint as a breath on the wind, reached his ears. Why? The single word lingered in the air, sharp and accusing. Hiroshi's mind raced, but he couldn't answer. There was no answer. Only silence. The whisper echoed in the room, lingering in the space between them. Why? The question was soft but cutting, like a blade that didn't need force to wound. Hiroshi's eyes darted to the ground, then to the empty walls. He couldn't escape it. The weight of her gaze. The emptiness in her eyes. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Akiko didn't move. She simply stood there, frozen, her presence suffocating the air around them. Her form was pale, almost transparent, like a ghost trapped in this world by something far darker than death itself. Hiroshi could feel his breath becoming shallow, the cold sweat gathering on the back of his neck. He took a step back, then another. But still, Akiko didn't move. She remained there, watching him with those eyes. Empty. Accusing. Her lips parted slightly, and again, the whisper came. Why did you do it? Hiroshi's chest tightened. He couldn't escape her now. The house felt as if it was closing in on him. The walls, the shadows, they seemed to shift, closing the space between him and the figure before him. He wanted to scream, to run, but he couldn't.
He was trapped.
Akiko's figure seemed to blur, the edges of her body fading in and out like a flickering candle. A part of him wanted to reach out to her, to apologize, to explain. But the words never came. There was nothing left to say. The silence between them stretched, unbearable and thick, until the only sound that remained was the beating of his heart in his ears. Hiroshi took another step back, but his foot hit something. He looked down. The blood. The pool of it from earlier, now congealing and thickening on the floor. His mind spun. Everything seemed to spin. The house, once so familiar, now felt alien, wrong, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The floor beneath him seemed to shift. The floorboards groaned under his weight. Then, as if in a final act of defiance, the floor split open beneath him. He didn't have time to react. In an instant, the darkness swallowed him whole. A scream, his own, was lost in the depths below. The figure of Akiko stood motionless, watching as the man who had caused it all vanished into the shadows. The house was still. The silence was complete. Akiko's ghost remained, her eyes still searching for something she would never find. And the house, now empty, stood as a silent witness to the horror that had once been. In the end, the only sound that remained was the soft whisper of the wind outside, as if the house itself was mourning the lives that had been lost. Forever. The wind outside howled through the cracks in the walls, as if it, too, was trying to escape the suffocating emptiness within. The house was silent once more, but it was a different kind of silence now. A silence steeped in tragedy, soaked in the blood of the innocent. Akiko's figure still lingered in the doorway, her ghostly presence a constant reminder of what had been lost. The faintest outline of her, so fragile and translucent, seemed to flicker in and out of existence like a dying ember. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched the empty house around her. Her once warm family home now lay in ruins, with the remnants of a love that had been twisted into something unrecognizable. The smell of death still hung in the air, heavy and pungent. In the rooms where laughter and joy had once filled the space, there was only the dark stain of horror left behind. No one would ever walk through the door again. No one would ever sit at the dinner table. The memories of a happy family were now nothing more than fleeting images in a shattered mind. And yet, the house remained standing. The walls, though cracked and worn, still held the echoes of the past, of happier days, of voices that had long since fallen silent. Akiko stood still in the hallway, her gaze still fixed on the empty space. She seemed to be waiting for something. For an answer, perhaps. But there was no answer to be found here. No reason for the nightmare that had unfolded in this very house. There would be no salvation. No redemption. Just endless silence. Outside, the wind continued to whip against the house, the sound growing louder as if the earth itself was crying out for what had happened inside. But there would be no rescue. No one would hear the screams of the fallen family. No one would come to unearth the truth. As the hours passed, the moon rose higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the floor. And still, the house stood as it had always stood, an empty shell, haunted by the ghosts of those who had once lived there. Akiko's figure faded, slowly, her form becoming fainter and fainter, until she was nothing more than a whisper on the wind. But the house, this broken, forsaken place, remained. It would remain forever. And with it, the memory of the horrors it had once contained.
Silent.
Unseen. Waiting. The night deepened, and the house remained cold and silent, standing in a stillness that seemed unnatural. Time had lost its meaning here. There were no clocks to mark the passing of the hours, no voices to break the oppressive quiet. The wind outside picked up again, rattling the windows, as if trying to make its way inside, but it was kept at bay by the heavy, locked doors. Inside, there was only the lingering scent of blood and death. The stains on the floor, on the walls, were all that remained of the once vibrant lives that had filled the space. No one knew what had truly happened here. No one could comprehend the depths of Hiroshi's madness, nor the true extent of the violence that had been inflicted. But the house remembered. The house could not forget. The walls seemed to hum with an eerie energy, as if they were alive, absorbing the terror that had taken place within them. Somewhere deep in the house, in a forgotten room that no one had dared to enter, a light flickered. Just a small, dim glow. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. As if something had stirred, something had been awakened. The light grew brighter, its flicker steady now, casting shadows across the room in strange, unnatural patterns. And then a sound, the softest whisper. It was too faint at first to recognize, but it grew clearer with each passing moment. A voice. A soft, sad voice. It was Akiko. Her voice, low and strained, echoed through the empty house. "I'm still here." The words hung in the air, as if they had been trapped for so long, waiting to be heard. Akiko's spirit, trapped between this world and the next, had not gone. Her presence lingered, as though she was waiting for something. Waiting for a reckoning. Waiting for an answer. But there was no answer to be found in this forsaken place. Only silence. And darkness. The house had become a tomb, a prison for all who had once lived and breathed within its walls. And now, even in death, they could not escape. Her voice continued to call out, soft, pleading. "I'm still here." It was as though she had never left. Her ghost remained, still haunting, still searching. The darkness grew deeper as the minutes stretched into hours. And yet, the house did not forget. The memories of what had happened here were etched into every surface, into every corner. The shadows shifted, as if moving with purpose, as if the house itself had become alive, absorbing the pain and suffering that had once filled it. Outside, the wind howled once again, but it couldn't reach the house. It couldn't touch the broken souls trapped inside. And so the house stood, empty,
Silent.
haunted. And Akiko's voice, though barely audible, continued to echo through the void, as if pleading for the world to remember. "I'm still here." And the house remembered. It would never forget. The wind outside howled relentlessly, but it could not break the stillness inside. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, a sense of something unfinished. The house, silent and empty, seemed to breathe with its own rhythm. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the walls, was like a pulse, steady, unyielding. Akiko's voice still lingered in the air, a soft whisper that seemed to come from every corner, echoing like a forgotten memory. "I'm still here." The words wrapped around the rooms like a chill, a reminder that something, someone, had never truly left. The light in the forgotten room flickered again, casting long shadows across the cracked, blood-stained walls. It wasn't just the wind outside now. Something inside the house had stirred. Akiko's presence had not faded. Her spirit lingered in every room, in every forgotten crevice. She was there, trapped, waiting. And the house was alive in a way no one could understand. The floorboards groaned, as if shifting under the weight of what had occurred there. A soft tapping sound echoed from somewhere deep within the walls. It was almost imperceptible at first, but soon it became rhythmic. A gentle, haunting tap-tap-tap, like the sound of fingernails brushing against wood. The house was calling back. And then, with a sudden jolt, the lights flickered throughout the house. The once dim glow of the forgotten room grew brighter, until it seemed to pulse with energy, casting unnatural shadows on the walls. In the hallway, the door that had been left ajar, the door that had led to so much suffering, began to creak open slowly. The tapping continued. Closer, closer. Akiko's ghostly figure, faint but present, appeared once again at the door. Her eyes were hollow, searching for something, someone, anyone to answer her call. She stepped forward into the hallway, her bare feet making no sound as she crossed the blood-stained floor. Her gaze remained fixed, distant, on the unseen space ahead. The house seemed to breathe with her as she walked, the very walls pulsing with the weight of her presence. "I'm still here," she whispered again, softer now, as though she were speaking to someone who would never answer. The light from the forgotten room grew even brighter, now a blinding, otherworldly glow that filled the space. The tapping stopped, and the house felt like it was holding its breath. For a moment, everything was still, and then in the stillness, there was a sound. A footstep. Not from Akiko, but from somewhere else. Somewhere in the house. A shadow darted past the edge of her vision. Her ghostly figure froze. And then, for the first time, her lips parted in a sound that wasn't a whisper. A scream. A raw, gut-wrenching scream that echoed through every room, rattling the very walls. The house trembled. The light flickered one last time, brighter than ever. And in that final moment, as the scream of Akiko filled the air, the house seemed to shake with the weight of its history. The walls cracked, the windows shattered, and then silence. Everything went dark. The house stood alone in the void, its doors wide open. Empty.
Silent.
Waiting. And the echoes of Akiko's scream continued to reverberate in the depths of the house, like a final, unanswered plea. The house would never forget. It would always remember. The darkness was all-encompassing now, swallowing the house whole. The coldness had deepened, more intense than ever before. And yet, even in the absence of light, the house was not truly empty. The faintest sound echoed through the quiet halls, the soft scurrying of something unseen. It was a sound that should have been ignored, but it couldn't be. Something or someone was moving within the walls. For the first time, the house was awake. The silence that had once settled like a heavy blanket now seemed to pulse, throb, as if something was stirring in the very foundation of the building. And then, from the farthest room, a door creaked open. It was the door to the basement, which had remained shut for years, never meant to be opened again. But now, it groaned under the weight of something unseen. The air in the house shifted, heavy with tension, as the door slowly swung inward. The house had become alive with something dark. And within the basement, in the deep shadows, a low, guttural sound began to rise. A scraping. A dragging. It was the sound of someone trying to escape from the very depths of the house. The house knew what it had done. It had witnessed every moment of terror, every scream, every heartbeat. And now it was awake, aware of its own twisted history. The scraping grew louder, nearer, as if something was moving toward the stairs. The walls of the basement seemed to groan, the weight of the house itself pressing down on whatever was inside. Then, a figure appeared at the bottom of the stairs, a dark silhouette against the dim light of the house. It was Hiroshi, but not the man who had walked through the house just hours before. This version of him was something else entirely. His face was pale, deathly so, his eyes wide open but vacant, hollow. He moved with an unnatural speed, dragging his feet along the floor as though the very ground was holding him in place. His hands, still stained with blood, reached out, as if searching for someone, to grab hold of. He didn't make a sound.
He didn't need to.
The house had already answered his call. It had been waiting for him. And as Hiroshi moved through the house, the walls seemed to tremble with every step he took. The bloodstains in the rooms began to shift, as though they were alive, spreading like veins throughout the house. Akiko's ghost was still there, her presence lingering in the shadows. But now it was different. Now, she watched as Hiroshi moved through the rooms, the very air around her thick with a sense of judgment, as if she were finally seeing him for what he truly was. Hiroshi stopped in the middle of the room, his eyes locked on a spot in the distance, as if he could see something there that no one else could. And then, without warning, The walls of the house seemed to close in. The shadows that had once been still began to move, stretching and twisting. The house was no longer just a witness. It was a participant, and the air grew thick with the weight of what had happened. For Hiroshi, it was too late to turn back. For Akiko, it was too late to speak. The house was no longer just haunted. It had become something else entirely. Something dark. Something alive.
And it would never let go.
The house stood still, silent but pulsing with an eerie energy that had never existed before. The shadows stretched unnaturally, twisting like living creatures along the walls. The scent of decay and blood lingered thick in the air, choking the very life out of the once warm home. Akiko's ghost watched from the corner, her empty eyes following Hiroshi's every move. He was no longer the man he had been. The hollow look in his eyes matched hers, as if they shared the same curse, the same eternal fate. The house had become a prison, trapping them both in a never-ending nightmare. Hiroshi stumbled forward, his hands still shaking with the weight of his actions, but there was no remorse in his eyes. He had done something far worse than murder. He had broken the very foundation of this place. His footsteps echoed through the house like thunder, each one a reminder of the horror he had caused. He had never intended for it to end like this. But the house, the cursed house, had consumed him, just as it had consumed everyone before him. With each step, the house seemed to grow tighter, its walls pressing in on him, the very structure itself bending under the weight of the suffering it had witnessed. Suddenly he stopped. He had reached the center of the living room. The bloodstains that had once seemed so fresh now appeared to move, their edges creeping like tendrils that reached toward him. Hiroshi's breath quickened, but there was no escape. Akiko's presence was no longer just a haunting. She was part of the house now. Her spirit had fused with its walls, its foundation. And as Hiroshi stood there, trembling in the center of the room, the walls began to close in around him. The air became thick and suffocating, the temperature dropping rapidly as if the house itself was freezing him in place. Akiko's ghost moved toward him, her hands reaching for him, her hollow eyes staring into his soul. He couldn't move. The darkness enveloped him, swallowing him whole. And then there was a sound, a final whisper, soft and broken. "Why did you leave me?" The words faded, but they lingered in the air, just as the darkness grew all-encompassing. The house had claimed them both. And with that, the house fell silent once again. The wind outside stopped. The world beyond the walls remained oblivious. But inside, the house was alive. And it would never forget. The house stood, silent and still, its shadows stretching long into the night. Everything was hushed, the kind of stillness that only deepens with time. The wind had died down, leaving no sound but the distant whisper of the earth itself. Akiko's ghost and Hiroshi were gone, consumed by the house they had once called home. The bloodstains on the floor had faded, the walls no longer echoed with screams or whispers. But the house had changed. It was no longer simply a house. It had become something else, something more. The energy that once pulsed through the walls had dimmed, but it remained, like an unspoken promise, an unbroken bond. The house was quiet now, at peace in a way it hadn't been in years. Yet, in its quiet, there was something haunting, a feeling of something left unfinished. As the first light of dawn crept through the cracked windows, it painted the once-forgotten rooms in shades of soft gold, almost tender. But there was no warmth here. The sun's light could never warm what had been broken. The past lingered, hidden in every corner, sealed within the very structure of the house. The cracks in the walls, the faint stains on the floor, all whispered the same haunting truth. No one had truly left. In the distance, the faintest sound of footsteps echoed from outside, as if the house was remembering something, or someone, it had long since forgotten. But when the door opened, there was no one there. The house was empty again. The wind, now soft and cool, whispered through the cracks, as if acknowledging what had happened here. But the house did not mourn. It did not cry for what had been lost. It simply stood, quiet and eternal, as it had always been. The world beyond the house moved on, unaware of the pain and torment contained within those walls. And inside, only the silence remained. A silence that spoke volumes, one that would never truly fade. For the house, though it stood empty, was never alone. It carried the weight of its history, the echoes of its past, and the memories of those who had once lived and died within it. And the house, silent and still, would never forget. It would never let go.